Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever looked at a big business decision, something like whether it makes more sense to uh, fix an old piece of equipment or just buy a new one?
Or maybe how a company decides what price tag to put on something totally new they're selling.
Exactly. And you just felt kind of overwhelmed by how many different angles they must have had to consider.
Yeah, it's rarely just a simple calculation, is it? These decisions have massive downstream effects, financially and, well, otherwise too. Getting them right is critical.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what our sources for this deep dive tackle head on. We're diving into the core concepts businesses use to make truly informed decisions.
We're moving from understanding the nuts and bolts of costs all the way through setting those crucial prices.
We've been pulling insights from some really detailed material here, stuff that lays out management accounting techniques designed specifically to guide these kinds of strategic and tactical choices.
Some quite dense chapters and illustrations, actually.
So our mission for this deep dive is really to cut through the complexity, extract the most important nuggets from these sources, and give you, our listener, a real shortcut to understanding these powerful business tools.
The goal is for you to walk away feeling well-informed, maybe ready to spot those aha moments when you see these concepts at play in the real world.
Right. So businesses face decisions constantly, and our sources make a useful distinction based on the time frame involved.
Yeah, they talk about strategic decisions, those are the long-term, big-picture choices, and then tactical or operational decisions, which are more focused, often short-term actions.
And they really stress that any significant business decision needs to be informed.
Hmm.
That means digging into the quantitative data, the numbers.
But also, and this is important, making qualitative judgments about things you can't easily put a price tag on. Reputation, morale, things like that.
Definitely. Now, for short-term decisions, the analysis tends to be, well, maybe a bit simpler than those big, long-term strategic ones.
Right. The long-term stuff might involve complex discounted cash flow models, factoring in the time value of money. But when the time frame is limited, you often don't need to worry about that so much.
And here's a key insight from the sources. I thought this was interesting. For many short-term decisions, fixed costs that are unavoidable regardless of the choice you make, they're considered irrelevant.
Exactly. They don't change based on the decision, so they shouldn't factor into the differential analysis, the comparison between your options.
So the focus for these tactical decisions shifts to relevant cash flows, what money comes in or goes out because of this specific decision.
And how does that impact the total contribution margin, which is just your revenue minus your variable costs? That's the key metric often.
The sources point to several common techniques for these short-term puzzles, things like cost volume profit analysis or CVP,
Key factor analysis, which is looking at constraints or bottlenecks.
and even linear programming for more complex scenarios with multiple limits. We'll definitely spend some time unpacking CVP and this whole idea of relevant costs first.
Right. Cost volume profit analysis, CDP, it's a fundamental tool. It helps us understand the interrelationships between a company's sales revenue, its costs, the level of activity or production, and ultimately, the profit.
Traditionally, its main purpose is to figure out that critical point. How many units do you need to sell or produce just to break even? Zero profit, zero loss.
Or maybe, how many units you need to sell to hit a specific target profit figure that management has set.
And the classic CDP approach, it simplifies costs into just two buckets, basically. Variable, meaning they change directly with the volume of units produced.
And fixed, meaning they stay the same regardless of volume, at least within a certain range of activity.
So if you're making bicycles, the steel, the rubber, the direct labor assembling them, typically variable costs.
But the rent on the factory building or maybe the CEO's salary, those are usually fixed. The traditional drivers are things directly linked to volume units, labor hours, machine hours.
And the classic break-even point formula under this view is pretty straightforward, isn't it?
Yeah, just total fixed costs divided by the contribution margin per unit.
And that contribution margin per unit is simply your selling price minus your variable cost per unit. It's what each unit contributes towards covering those fixed costs and then hopefully generating profit.
Exactly. But CVP isn't just a planning tool, is it? The sources show it's also great for evaluating decisions after they're made, or maybe modeling the impact of potential changes.
Like if you're thinking about modifying a product, you can use CVP to estimate how that might affect the price, the variable costs, maybe even fixed costs, sales volume, and finally your bottom line profit.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit more realistic, I suppose. The traditional CVP model has a limitation.
Which it is.
It assumes every cost is either purely variable with volume or purely fixed. But modern businesses, well, they have costs that aren't driven solely by how many units roll off the assembly line.
Right. Activities happen that cost money, regardless of pure volume. This is where activity-based costing, or ABC, comes in.
Exactly. ABC helps businesses identify different activities that drive costs, giving a much more nuanced picture of cost behavior beyond just production volume.
The sources describe a cost hierarchy using ABC. You still have unit-level costs. Those do vary with each unit produced, like direct material. Still there.
But then you have batch-level costs. Now, these costs change based on the number of batches you run, not the number of units in each batch.
Like machine setup costs.
Perfect example.
Right.
Whether you're producing a batch of 50 units or 500 units, setting up the machine takes roughly the same amount of time and resources, right? The cost driver isn't the individual unit, it's the setup activity itself.
Makes sense. What else is in the hierarchy?
Then there are product-sustaining costs. These support a specific product line, but don't really vary with volume or batches. Think about costs for product design, maybe managing a product's life cycle, or even specific advertising campaigns just for one product.
Okay, so tied to the product itself, not how many you make or how many batches.
Precisely. And finally, you have facilities-level costs. These are the broad general operating costs of the business, factory rent, property taxes, maybe general admin salaries, usually fixed, and harder to trace directly to specific products or activities.
So by using ABC, companies can pool costs based on these different drivers units, batches, products, facilities, giving management much deeper insight into what truly causes costs.
And you can adapt the CVP analysis to use this more granular cost information, which is pretty powerful.
Yeah, the sources show how the break-even calculation actually changes. Instead of just lumping all non-variable with unit costs into one big fixed costs number,
The ABC CVP formula breaks it out more. It includes costs driven by batches, costs driven by product-sustaining activities, and the facility-level costs separately in that numerator, the part you divide by contribution margin per unit.
so it still looks like fixed cost contribution margin per unit, but the fixed cost part is much more detailed.
Essentially, yes. It isolates those non-volume-driven costs. This adapted formula gives management real insight into how decisions that affect activity levels, like reducing the number of production setups or maybe simplifying the product line, can impact break-even and profitability. It's not just about sales volume anymore.
The illustration one example with children's cycles really brings this to life, doesn't it?
It does. Initially, the traditional CVP analysis for, I think it was 10,000 units, showed a certain break-even point and a projected profit figure. Pretty standard stuff.
But when they looked through the lens of ABC, they realized a significant chunk of what they just called fixed costs was actually driven by the sheer number of machine setups they needed because they were running small batches.
Right. The ABC analysis revealed exactly how many setups they were doing each month, and crucially, the cost per setup.
And the key takeaway here, even if the initial break-even number happened to be the same in this specific case, is that ABC gives management that actionable detail. They suddenly see, hold on, 20% of our non-volume costs are actually these setup activities.
And that insight leads directly to action, as shown in the next part of the illustration. The company decided, okay, let's try increasing the batch size.
Which meant they needed far fewer setups per month.
Exactly. And that significantly reduced their total setup costs.
Now, I remember they mentioned increasing the batch size added some extra storage costs, right?
It did, yeah. But the savings from doing fewer setups were much larger. So when they reran the ABC CVP calculation with the new batch size,
Their break-even point actually dropped, and their overall projected profit increased.
it perfectly demonstrates the power of understanding different cost drivers. By managing that batch-level activity, the setups, they improve their financial performance, even with that trade-off of slightly higher storage costs.
And the sources connect this directly to operational flexibility, too.
Right. Fewer setups mean less time machines are sitting idle waiting for changes, so you free up capacity. And lower setup costs make it cheaper and faster to switch between making different product types, maybe children's cycles one day and adult cycles the next, increases agility.
They also touched on whether labor costs should be included in setup costs.
Yeah, that was interesting. If it's temporary or outsourced labor brought in specifically for setups, then yes, include it. But if it's permanent staff who would be idle otherwise, their salary is kind of a sunk cost for that specific setup decision. Unless they could be doing something else profitable, then you'd need an opportunity cost.
The sources also briefly mentioned CVP's use in service industries and nonprofits, where the big challenge is just defining and measuring output clearly.
And in just-in-time, JIT environments, too. JIT aims for tiny batch sizes, ideally 1 unit, which dramatically changes the cost structure, often lower variable costs, but potentially higher fixed costs in automation, and batch costs almost disappear.
There is a good quote summarizing this. The use of activity-based costing does not mean that CVP analysis is less valuable. In fact, it becomes more valuable since it delivers more precise understandings concerning cost behavior.
Nicely put. It enhances CVP, doesn't replace it.
Okay, so CVP and ABC help us understand how costs behave generally, but when it comes to making a specific short-term decision, like should we do X or should we do Y, we need to pinpoint exactly which costs actually matter for that choice.
And this brings us squarely to the concept of relevant costs. This is absolutely fundamental in the sources.
So what makes a cost relevant?
For a cost or revenue to be relevant to a particular decision, it has to meet 2 specific tests. First, it must be a future cost or revenue, something that hasn't happened yet. You can't change the past.
Makes sense. And the second test?
It must be a differential cost or revenue, meaning its amount must be different depending on which alternative course of action you choose.
Okay, so future and different. This is crucial, isn't it?
Absolutely. Money you've already spent, those are sunk costs, totally irrelevant. Ignore them. And future costs, that will be exactly the same no matter which option you pick. Also irrelevant to that specific decision. You only care about the costs and the revenues that change based on your choice.
The sources list tons of common short-run decisions that rely heavily on this concept.
Yeah, things like make or buy. Should we make something ourselves or outsource it?
Sell or process further, take an intermediate product and sell it now, or spend more to make it fancier.
Minimum pricing for a special order, maybe.
Definitely. Keep or drop decisions. Should we get rid of an unprofitable product line or division?
Evaluating special orders in general, especially when you have spare capacity.
And figuring out the best mix of products to produce when resources are tight product mix decisions.
Let's look at a few examples from the sources to see relevant costs in action. The make or buy decision is a classic one.
Outsourcing, right?
All right.
Should we produce this component or service internally or just buy it from an outside vendor?
The financial analysis here boils down to comparing the incremental costs of buying usually the purchase price from the supplier
Versus the avoidable costs of making it internally. What costs would actually disappear if you stopped making it?
and critically, you have to factor in opportunity costs. This trips people up sometimes. Well, if making the item yourself uses up resources, say machine time or skilled labor that could have been used for something else profitable, that lost potential profit is an opportunity cost of making it. It's a relevant benefit of buying it, because buying frees up those resources.
Okay. So the decision rule, financially speaking, is if the costs you save by not making it, plus any opportunity costs you gain by freeing up resources, are greater than the cost of buying it from the supplier.
Then outsourcing looks like the better financial choice. But, as always, there are those qualitative factors lurking.
The DBA fans component illustration, illustration 5, was a perfect example of this getting tricky.
It really was. DBA was buying a component for, what was it, 190 euro? There, they could make it internally for only 183 in variable costs.
Simple comparison says make it and save 7 per unit, right? Easy decision.
Not so fast. The sources showed that making it internally was tied into a bigger plan to increase overall fan production significantly.
And to sell all those extra fans, they discovered they'd have to drop the fan's selling price by 5%, which is quite a bit.
And spend a hefty $1.2 million a year on extra advertising.
Ouch. So when you looked at the total picture, that small euro saving per component, minus the big hit from the price drop on all fans, minus the huge advertising cost needed for the extra volume.
The financial picture completely flipped. Making the component and increasing volume actually became significantly less profitable overall compared to just continuing to buy the component and selling at the original volume and price.
It really highlights a crucial point. Relevant cost analysis isn't just about the direct cost difference of the item itself. It's about the entire incremental impact on the business's revenues and costs resulting from the decision.
You got it. And even when the numbers point clearly one way, those qualitative factors can still swing the decision. Things like, can we maintain quality control if we make it? Is the supplier reliable if we buy? What's the impact on our workforce if we outsource? How certain are those supplier prices for the future?
These can easily override a purely financial calculation.
Absolutely. Another common one is Sell or process further. You've got an intermediate product, maybe something that comes out of a joint process. Do you sell it as is or put more time and money into it to turn it into something potentially more valuable?
The rule here seems super focused. Only look forward.
Exactly. Costs you've already sunk into getting the product to its current state, completely irrelevant. They happen before this decision point. Forget them.
So you only care about the incremental revenue you get from processing further versus the incremental costs of doing that extra processing.
That's it. If the additional revenue is greater than the additional cost, process further. Simple as that, financially.
The example with joint product C showed this clearly. It had costs incurred before the point where it's separated from other products. Those were irrelevant joint costs, sunk.
The decision was based only on the 37 per unit they could get by processing C further compared to the 20 per unit, 15 marginal plus 5 fixed, both incurred after separation, of costs needed to do that further processing.
Since 37 revenue is more than the 20 cost, the answer was process further. That extra 17 ho per unit contributes positively towards covering those irrelevant joint costs they already spent.
Right. Though qualitative factors still matter. Do you even have the capacity to, the machines, the labor to do the further processing? Will it delay other important products? Are there actually customers who prefer the intermediate product as it is?
Good points. Okay, minimum pricing decisions, often for special orders when a company has spare capacity, also rely heavily on relevant costs.
Yeah, this is about figuring out the absolute rock bottom price you'd be willing to accept for a one-off order without actually losing money on that specific order. It's useful when you're trying to fill idle capacity or maybe break into a new market segment.
The principle is that the minimum price needs to cover all the incremental costs of filling that order, plus any opportunity costs incurred by taking it.
The XL Polymers special job illustration, illustration 6, gave a really detailed look at calculating these opportunity costs, which can be tricky.
I remember that one. They needed a specific material, R1, which was excess stock they would otherwise have to pay someone to dispose of.
Exactly. So using it for this special job avoided that disposal cost. The opportunity cost of using the material was effectively saving a negative cost or a benefit.
Interesting. And the labor, G1 and G2.
Right. For G2 labor, they had plenty of idle capacity that week. The workers were getting paid their salaries anyway, and there was no other productive work for them to do at that time. So the opportunity cost of using that G2 labor for the special job was zero. It cost nothing extra.
But for G1 labor, it was different. They needed more hours than they had idle G1 workers available.
Correct. Those extra G1 hours would require hiring temporary labor or paying overtime, incurring an actual additional cost per hour. That cost of needing extra G1 labor was a relevant opportunity cost.
So when they summed up all the opportunity costs of saving from using the excess material minus the cost of bringing in that extra G1 labor,
they arrived at a net opportunity cost for the entire job. And the sources concluded that the absolute minimum price they should bid for this special job is just that net opportunity cost.
So basically, a price that ensures they don't incur any net additional out-of-pocket costs by taking the job. It wouldn't contribute to fixed overheads, but it wouldn't make them worse off either.
Precisely. Okay, keep or drop decisions. Another classic relevant cost application. Should you get rid of an unprofitable product line, division, or maybe a retail store?
The logic seems similar. Compare what you lose versus what you save.
That's the core idea. You compare the revenue or contribution margin you lose by dropping the segment against the costs you actually save by dropping it. And the focus has to be on the costs that are directly traceable to that segment and would genuinely disappear if you eliminated it.
Primarily, it's variable costs and any fixed costs that are specifically tied to that segment and are avoidable.
Exactly. The decision rule financially is drop it if the costs you save are greater than the revenue or contribution you lose, always keeping those qualitative factors in mind, of course.
The Ridabi Ltd. Division C example, illustration 7, was a fantastic counterintuitive case here.
It really was. Division C was showing a significant loss on the company's internal reports. On the surface, it seemed obvious, drop it and improve overall profitability.
But the sources dug deeper. They showed that Division C's sales volume was actually helping lower the variable costs in the other divisions, A and B, because of volume discounts or scale effect.
Right, so if Division C was dropped, the volume would decrease, and A and B's variable costs would actually increase. That's a relevant cost of dropping C.
So when Rabi Ltd. Performed the proper relevant cost analysis, they looked at the contribution margin lost from Division C versus the specific fixed costs they truly avoid by dropping it.
Thus, they factored in that consequential variable cost increase in divisions A and B.
And the numbers revealed something surprising, didn't they?
They did. The contribution loss from C, combined with the variable cost increase in A and B, was actually greater than the avoidable fixed costs they would save by dropping C.
So dropping the division would actually make the company worse off financially overall.
Exactly. It perfectly underscores the importance of looking at the total incremental impact across the entire business, not just the reported profit or loss of the segment in isolation. Don't just look at the accounting report for that one division.
Great point. Okay, special order decisions. Similar logic again. If a company has excess capacity, should they accept a one-off order, maybe at a reduced price?
Yep. The relevant costs are the variable operating costs of fulfilling that specific order, plus any additional fixed costs specifically required just for this job, maybe special tooling or setup.
And if the company is already running at full capacity?
Then a major relevant cost enters the picture, the opportunity cost. You'd have to give up some of your profitable regular sales to make room for the special order. The contribution margin lost on those regular sales becomes a very relevant cost of accepting the special order.
The BNZ Ltd. Illustration, number 8, about plastic bottles versus toys, brought in another important layer, the limiting factor. In this case, it was machine hours.
Right. They could make bottles or they could make toys, but they only had a certain number of machine hours available in total.
So when resources like that are constrained, you can't just look at which product has the highest contribution margin per unit, can you?
No, that would be misleading. You need to figure out which product yields the highest contribution margin per unit of the limiting factor. In this case, per machine hour.
And I recall toys generated significantly more contribution per machine hour than bottles.
They did, yes, making them the priority use of that limited machine time, based purely on maximizing short-term financial contribution.
But the sources immediately added a huge qualitative caveat here, didn't they?
Absolutely crucial one. While financially prioritizing the high-margin toys might maximize short-term profit on paper, it could mean neglecting existing, maybe long-term relationships with customers who regularly order the lower-margin bottles.
And keeping existing customers happy is vital for long-term sustainability, often less costly than acquiring new ones too.
Precisely. So that potential damage to long-term relationships is a major non-financial factor, often more valuable than optimizing profit for a single period based purely on contribution per machine hour.
It really highlights that even within a quantitative analysis like contribution per limiting factor, the strategic context and those non-financial factors are absolutely paramount.
Maybe the answer isn't just choosing one over the other, but finding a creative solution, like the sources explored. Could we outsource the less profitable product, bottles, if possible, to free up internal capacity for the more profitable one, toys?
They even calculated how many hours of internal excess capacity they'd need to make the toys themselves just to break even on the specific mold cost compared to simply subcontracting the toys.
Yeah, comparing the internal variable cost saving versus the external price to see if that saving covered the fixed mold cost over enough units, a very specific relevant cost calculation.
Product mix decisions, especially when you have multiple limiting factors like limited labor time and limited raw materials and limited machine hours, become really complex.
You bet. Simply prioritizing based on contribution per unit of just one factor won't cut it anymore. It won't find the truly optimal solution.
This is where the sources brought in analytical tools like linear programming.
Right. Linear programming is basically a mathematical technique. It's used to find the absolute best combination of products to make that will maximize your total profit or contribution margin, given all those different constraints operating simultaneously, resource limits, labor limits, even market demand limits for each product.
The illustration with products X and Y needing material, depth A hours and depth B hours, where all three resources were limited, really demonstrated this. You couldn't just eyeball the best mix.
Yep. No way. The rankings based on contribution per unit of each resource were different. You needed a structured approach like linear programming, maybe using software or graphical methods, to solve for the precise quantities of X and Y that maximize total contribution without exceeding any of the resource availability limits or demand ceilings.
All these examples make or buy, sell or process, keep or drop, special orders, product mix, they all underscore a fundamental point the sources made repeatedly.
Which is?
That while the numbers, the quantitative analysis, are absolutely essential, purely financial analysis is often insufficient for making truly good business decisions.
Absolutely. And they dedicate significant focus, rightly so, to the importance of non-financial considerations.
These are the things you can't easily express in dollars and cents, right? Like the impact on product quality, employee morale and satisfaction, customer satisfaction levels, your company's reputation in the community, environmental impact, your brand name value.
Exactly. These factors are inherently long-term focused. They're critical for a business's sustainability and its ability to thrive beyond just the next financial quarter. Ignoring them purely for short-term financial gains can lead to serious, sometimes irreparable problems down the road.
The sources are realistic, though, acknowledging the limitations. Non-financial info can be hard to measure consistently. It can be subjective, maybe costly to gather.
True, but that doesn't make it less important. You still have to consider it.
And hand in hand with non-financial factors are ethical considerations. The sources really emphasize this.
Yes, they stress that applying ethical standards, basic things like honesty, fairness, transparency, and really thinking through the consequences of your decisions on all affected parties, not just shareholders, is not just a moral obligation. It often contributes directly to long-term commercial success
How so?
by building trust, loyalty, and a strong reputation. They specifically highlight that ethical problems often arise when businesses get tunnel vision, focusing only on short-term financial profit without considering the broader impact on people, communities, or the environment. Ethical behavior is a powerful, long-term asset.
The illustration 4 with the HHCL healthcare plan was a really stark reminder of this tension.
It was chilling, wasn't it? A consultant proposed reducing patient hospital stays slightly to save on variable cost per day, and financially based purely on the calculated cost savings, plus some potential extra revenue from the expected increase in readmissions, which the consultant cynically viewed as new revenue. The plan looked quite profitable on paper, a significant boost to the bottom line.
But the sources immediately flagged the profound human and ethical implications.
Right. Discharging patients potentially before they're fully ready, just to boost financial metrics, even if it looks good in the short term. It risks patient well-being, causes stress and disruption for families, things you can't quantify, and severely damages the healthcare provider's reputation and trustworthiness in the long run.
It perfectly showed that a decision looking purely rational on a spreadsheet can be deeply problematic when viewed through a non-financial and ethical lens. Both perspectives have to be weighed.
Definitely. And the Sprinter Sportswear case scenario about outsourcing ethics reinforced this, especially in today's complex global supply chains.
That was about finding child labor in poor conditions in supplier factories, even if they were subcontractors.
Yes. Even if Sprinter wasn't legally the direct employer, the sources argue they have a moral responsibility as the ultimate customer benefiting from that labor.
Why that responsibility?
Because modern businesses are increasingly seen as having a duty of care that extends to everyone involved in their value chain, not just their direct employees or immediate customers. Child labor is illegal, fundamentally harmful, and the negative publicity alone can devastate a brand's image.
So what did the sources suggest Sprinter should do?
Practical things. Establish and rigorously enforce a strict code of conduct for all suppliers covering minimum age, working conditions, safety, environmental standards. Implement robust audit programs to ensure compliance, not just rely on paperwork. And even consider transparency measures, like publishing supplier lists to allow external monitoring by watchdog groups. It's about ensuring your pursuit of efficiency and low costs doesn't come at the expense of basic human rights and dignity.
It seems the sources pull all these different threads together into a kind of general structured approach for making these tactical decisions.
They do offer a model, yeah. It's a logical sequence. First, clearly define the specific problem you're trying to solve.
Step 1, know what you're deciding.
Step 2, identify the feasible alternatives you're actually considering. Eliminate the ones that just aren't practical.
Okay.
Step 3, try to pinpoint all the potential costs and benefits, both financial and non-financial, associated with each of those feasible alternatives.
Then step 4, and this is crucial, narrow it down to just the relevant costs and benefits. Remember, those future ones that are different between the alternatives. Do the differential analysis.
Step 5, step back from the numbers and consciously assess the non-financial factors and any ethical issues involved.
Yeah.
Bring those qualitative aspects into the picture.
And finally, step 6, select the alternative that offers the greatest overall benefit, considering both the financial outcome and those non-financial and ethical aspects. Make a balanced judgment.
The HHCL healthcare case fits this model perfectly. Problem: financial pressure, cost control. Alternatives: Reduce patient stay versus maintain status quo. Cost benefits. Calculated savings. Potential for readmission revenue versus readmission cost. Relevant costs. The incremental financial impact analysis. Non-financial ethical. Huge factors around patient welfare, provider reputation. Decision requires balancing these often conflicting factors, not just choosing the financially optimal one.
Okay, so we've spent a good deal of time on the cost side of things, understanding cost behavior with CVP and ABC, identifying relevant costs for specific tactical decisions like make or buy or keep or drop. Now let's shift gears and talk about the other half of the profitability equation, revenue, specifically the crucial decisions around pricing.
Right, and as the sources put it very directly, and I think it's worth repeating, a pricing decision is one of the most crucial and difficult decisions that a firm has to make.
It really makes sense when you think about it. Price is the only element of the classic marketing mix product, place, promotion, price that actually brings money in. Everything else is a cost center.
Exactly, so it directly impacts your profitability, maybe more than any other single variable. But setting the right price is incredibly tricky, especially when you've got competitors breathing down your neck.
And while understanding your costs is absolutely essential background, you need to know your floor.
The sources really stress that customer demand and the competitive environment are often more significant in determining the final price you can actually charge. Costs might set the minimum, but demand and competition often dictate the ceiling, or where you land in between.
A smart pricing strategy, according to the sources, aims to do a lot more than just cover costs and make a profit margin.
Yeah, they list several things. It should maybe incentivize technological advancement, help you use your resources efficiently, work to balance how much you can supply with how much customers actually want, perhaps even help promote exports if that's a goal, and generally try to avoid creating negative economic ripples.
And pricing decisions are always linked back to the company's broader strategic goals, aren't they? Whether that's maximizing profit above all else, or maybe maximizing sales volume to gain market share, or hitting a certain production output, or just optimizing the use of some scarce resource. The goal shapes the pricing approach.
Basic economic theory on pricing gives us a starting point. It suggests that a company trying to maximize profit will produce and sell units right up to the point where the cost of producing one more unit, the marginal cost, or MC,
Equals the revenue gain from selling that one additional unit, the marginal revenue, or MRR.
Right. MRMC is the theoretical sweet spot for profit maximization. The sources show an example where a company figures out this optimal volume where the gap between total revenue and total cost is widest, and then uses the demand curve to find the price customers will actually pay for that specific quantity.
But how pricing works in the real world heavily depends on the market structure you're operating in, doesn't it?
Hugely. In perfect competition, where there are many sellers of an identical product, businesses are basically price takers. The market sets the price through supply and demand.
So they just decide how much to produce.
Pretty much. They can sell as much as they want at that prevailing market price, so they'll produce as long as that price is at or above their marginal cost. An example in the sources shows a company in this market just finding the output level where their rising marginal cost curve hits the fixed market price that's their profit maximizing quantity.
What about a monopoly, where you're the only seller?
Well, then you have much more control over the price. You're a price setter, but you still have to consider the demand curve. If you raise the price too high, demand will fall. So you'll still aim for that MRMC output level to maximize profit, but you then have the power to set the price on the demand curve that corresponds to that optimal output.
Okay. Then there's monopolistic competition.
Right. That involves many firms selling similar but slightly differentiated products, think restaurants or clothing brands. They have some pricing power because their product isn't identical, but they still face significant competition. They'll likely compare their MR and MC too.
And oligopolies, that's just a few dominant players, right?
Exactly. Think airlines, mobile phone carriers, maybe major oil companies. The key feature here is intense awareness of rivals and interdependence. A price change by one firm is almost certain to trigger reactions from the others.
Which often leads to price stability, doesn't it? They don't want to start a price war.
Precisely. So in oligopolies, you often see a preference for competing on things other than price.
Like focusing on quality, customer service, branding, heavy advertising, promotions, loyalty schemes, all ways to attract customers without getting into a destructive downward price spiral.
Oligopolies might also sometimes engage in more aggressive pricing strategies, though some are legally dubious. Predatory pricing, selling below cost with the specific intent to drive out competitors, is generally illegal.
What about limit pricing?
That's setting prices low enough maybe just above cost, specifically to discourage new companies from even thinking about entering the market. Less aggressive than predatory, but still strategic.
And sometimes, though often illegal, they might engage in collusion, secretly agreeing to keep prices high together.
Yes, antitrust laws target that heavily. Cost plus pricing, simply adding a standard markup to their calculated costs, is another common, less aggressive method you see in oligopolies, especially for setting baseline prices.
Okay, moving to some general pricing principles the sources discussed. Price customization sounds interesting.
It is. It's basically tailoring your price based on differences in customer segments or the value they perceive in your product or service.
Can you get examples?
Sure. Offering different prices for different versions of a product, like varying memory sizes in phones or laptops. Giving loyalty discounts based on a customer's past purchase history. Offering concessions based on demographics, student discounts, senior citizen rates. Or using time-based pricing, like charging less for flights at off-peak times or matinee movie tickets.
That makes sense. Another crucial concept was price sensitivity. How much does changing the price actually affect customer demand?
Right, understanding elasticity is key. The sources mention Nagel's 9 factors that influence this sensitivity. Things like, is your product truly unique, or are there easy substitutes? How aware are customers of those substitutes? How easy is it for them to compare prices and features?
Also, how significant is the cost of your product relative to the customer's total budget? If it's a small part, they might be less sensitive to price changes.
Exactly. Other factors include things like, does your product contribute to some larger end benefit for the customer? Is the cost shared with someone else, like insurance? Is there a sunk investment already made? Does price signal quality? Can the customer easily stockpile if prices are expected to rise? All these affect how they react to price changes.
So how do companies figure this out?
It's tough. Sometimes through controlled experiments, market research, analyzing past sales data, or just experience judgment.
The sources also laid out a kind of structured, step-by-step approach for actually making pricing decisions.
Yeah, an 8-step process. 1, define your pricing objectives. First, what are you trying to achieve? 2, understand the demand curve and its elasticity for your product. 3, estimate your costs accurately, variable, fixed, relevant costs. 4, assess how customers perceive value and what their willingness to pay might be.
So objectives, demand, costs, customer value. What's next?
5, analyze your competitors' prices, costs, and likely reactions. 6, select an appropriate pricing method or strategy based on all the above, cost plus, value-based, etc. 7, determine the final specific list price. 8, and crucially, continuously review and adjust that price based on market feedback and changing conditions. It's not a one-time decision.
And those pricing objectives themselves can vary widely, right? We mentioned profit maximization, but it could also be just surviving in a really tough market.
Or aiming for rapid market penetration with low prices, or maybe the opposite, market skimming with high prices to position yourself as the premium quality leader. The objective drives the strategy.
Pricing new products seems particularly challenging because you just don't have that established demand data to work with.
It's very uncertain. The sources helpfully categorize new products to guide the thinking here. They talk about revolutionary products, truly brand new to the world, creating their own value, like maybe the first personal computer or smartphone was.
For those, you can often charge a premium.
Often, yes. Then there are evolutionary products. These are upgrades or improved versions of existing things, maybe a new phone model with a better camera. Price is usually higher based on the added benefits, costs, and what the market will bear.
And the third type.
Me Too products. These are essentially imitations of products already out there, maybe a new brand of adjustable work table that's similar to others. Here, you're likely a market follower and pretty much have to take the prevailing market price.
So for those truly new, maybe revolutionary or evolutionary products, the sources highlighted 2 main initial pricing strategies: skimming and penetration.
Right. Skimming pricing involves setting a high initial price and then gradually lowering it over time as the market evolves and competition enters.
Why do that?
Several reasons. If you have early adopters who are less price sensitive and value the novelty. If demand is relatively inelastic at first, it allows you to skim the cream off the top of the market segment by segment. It can help recover high initial R&D or promotion costs quickly, and that initial high profit can help finance further development. Samsung's high-end smartphone launches are often cited as using a skimming strategy.
Okay, and the opposite. penetration pricing?
That's setting a deliberately low initial price to gain a large market share quickly, penetrating the mass market from the start.
When would that make sense?
When demand is expected to be very sensitive to price, highly elastic. When you anticipate significant cost savings from producing at a large scale very quickly, economies of scale,
Right.
or when you want to build a strong market position fast to create a barrier and deter potential competitors from even entering.
And the sources were careful to distinguish penetration pricing from illegal predatory pricing again.
Yes, very clearly. Penetration is about gaining market share legitimately with low prices. Predatory pricing is about setting prices below cost with the specific harmful intent of driving existing competitors out of business. Different intent, different legality.
Okay, what about pricing for products that are already established in the market?
For existing products, companies use a variety of methods. Cost-based methods are very common. You estimate your cost and add a desired profit margin or markup.
This could be based on full cost, which includes an allocation of fixed overheads, though allocating fixed costs can be arbitrary and problematic.
Or it could be based on just variable cost, adding a larger markup to cover fixed costs and profit. Simple markup pricing, just cost plus X%, is very common, especially when demand is hard to estimate.
There was also target rate of return pricing.
Yes, that's more complex. You calculate the unit cost, then add a component that represents your desired profit percentage on the capital invested in making that product. It requires pretty accurate estimates of both costs and sales volume to work well, often suitable for less competitive markets or custom jobs.
The Bosch illustration number 10 showed a really complex cost calculation feeding into a target price, didn't it? Even factoring in learning curves.
It did. The learning curve effect, where labor becomes more efficient as workers repeat a task, means the cost per unit actually decreases over time for new processes. Bosch needed to factor that declining cost into their pricing over the life of the contract to ensure they achieve their overall desired profit margin. It shows how sophisticated cost estimation can get when setting prices.
Then there's competition-based pricing. This seems to ignore your own costs and demand, right?
Largely, yes. It focuses almost entirely on what your competitors are charging. Going rate pricing means setting your price at or near the average price prevailing in the market. You see this often in oligopolies or where products are very similar, like gasoline, and costs are hard to measure precisely for each firm.
And sealed bid pricing.
That's used in competitive bidding situations, like for government contracts or construction projects. You submit a confidential bid. You need to bid higher than your marginal cost to make a profit, but you also have to consider what you think competitors will bid and the probability of actually winning the contract at different price levels. It's a balancing act.
What about psychological pricing?
That's leveraging customer perception. The classic example is prices ending in €9,999 instead of $1,000 or $59,999 for electronics. It just feels significantly cheaper to many consumers, even though the difference is tiny, sometimes called beta pricing in India, apparently.
Interesting. And finally, value-based pricing. This seems like the holy grail, but maybe the hardest.
It can be. It
Yeah.
sets the price based on the customer's perceived value of the product or service, not primarily on cost or competition.
How do you measure that value?
It's tricky. The sources talk about true economic value, TEV. This is calculated as the cost of the customer's next best alternative, plus the monetary value of whatever makes your product perform better than that alternative. The System X example showed calculating this differential value.
But TV is theoretical. What about perceived value?
That's simply what the customer actually believes the product is worth to them and is willing to pay. This is influenced by marketing, brand image, perceived benefits, and might be lower than the theoretical TEV.
The ideal price range, then, is somewhere between your cost, the floor, and the customer's perceived value, the ceiling.
Exactly. Any price in that zone creates value for both the buyer, they pay less than they perceive it's worth, and the seller, they receive more than it costs them. And creating that perceived value involves everything: the product features, the promotion, the distribution channels, and the pricing strategy itself.
The product lifecycle also plays a big role in how pricing adapts over time.
Definitely. In the introduction stage, you might use skimming or penetration, as we discussed. In the growth stage, as sales increase and competition enters, companies often reduce prices to penetrate the market further. Unit costs typically fall during growth due to economies of scale and learning effects.
Then in maturity, sales growth slows, competition is intense, and prices tend to stabilize. Cost reductions also tend to level off.
And finally, in the decline stage, sales fall off. Prices might be cut significantly to clear out inventory, unless the company finds a way to reposition the product for a niche market or harvest remaining profits.
The Netcom Ltd case scenario illustrated these changes well, showing how price drivers, competition, volume, and cost drivers, scale, learning, batch size, negotiation, shift as a product moves from its growth phase into maturity.
Yeah, it showed price reductions and cost reductions happening in growth, then things stabilizing more in maturity, with costs potentially even rising slightly as the big scale and learning effects taper off.
Pricing services has its own unique challenges, according to the sources.
It does, largely due to the inherent characteristics of services. They're intangible, you can't touch or see them beforehand. They're inseparable, often produced and consumed at the same time, with the customer present. Quality can be dammered, variable depending on who provides the service, when, and where. And they're perishable. You can't store unsold service capacity like a vacant hotel room or empty airline seat for tonight's flight. That capacity is lost forever.
The sources categorized services too, didn't they? People processing, product processing.
Yeah, things like people processing, transportation, lodging, healthcare, product possession processing, repair, maintenance, freight transport, mental stimulus processing, education, entertainment, advertising, and information processing, accounting, legal services, consulting. Each has slightly different pricing dynamics.
So what are the key pricing issues for services?
Often needing to tailor services and prices to individual customer needs, which makes pricing complex. Dealing with the intangible costs customers face, like time spent. Navigating regulation, which is common in areas like healthcare or education. Sometimes dealing with collective pricing set by professional bodies, like for lawyers or doctors in some systems. And strategically using price to manage demand, especially smoothing out peaks and troughs. Think peak versus off-peak pricing for utilities or travel.
Pricing seems to be evolving too with emerging business models.
Definitely. For hyper-disruptive innovations, pricing depends heavily on how truly unique the disruption is and how easily competitors can imitate it. Sustainability models are increasingly trying to incorporate social and environmental costs or benefits to the price, going beyond pure economics. Think fair trade coffee or carbon offsets.
Pricing luxury versus essential goods also reflects these sustainability concerns sometimes.
And pricing in emerging national markets, like India, often requires intense focus on value for money and cost effectiveness due to high price sensitivity. Companies might offer different, more basic or stripped-down editions of products specifically for these markets.
The sources also emphasize the importance of sensitivity analysis in pricing decisions.
Yes, basically asking what if. What if demand is 10% lower than we forecast? What if a key competitor cuts their price by 5%? What if our raw material costs increase unexpectedly? Sensitivity analysis involves systematically changing these key assumptions or parameters in your financial model to see how sensitive your projected profitability is to those changes.
Why is that so significant?
It helps evaluate the riskiness of a pricing strategy. It can inform decisions about how much to spend on R&D or marketing to support a certain price point. It helps understand the potential impact of external factors you can't control, like market demand or exchange rates, and internal decisions you can control, like costs or launch dates. Ultimately, it helps strike a better, more informed balance between generating sales volume and ensuring profitability under uncertainty.
They even touched on pricing in really special, tough circumstances, like a recession.
Right. During a severe downturn, a company might, for a limited period, price below its total cost but still above its marginal or variable cost.
Why would they do that? Lose money on every sale?
The idea is that covering variable costs and making some contribution towards fixed costs might be better than shutting down completely. It can help keep skilled labor employed, prevent machinery from deteriorating through disuse, maintain market presence and customer relationships, and be ready to ramp up quickly when the economy recovers. But the sources caution. This is a short-term survival tactic only, not a sustainable strategy. You don't want to get locked into long-term low prices.
And pricing below even marginal cost, is that ever justified?
Very rarely, and only temporarily. The sources suggest maybe if raw materials are highly perishable and about to spoil anyway, or to clear out huge excess stock where the carrying costs are enormous. Possibly as a very short-term loss leader tactic to popularize a brand new product or to boost sales of other much higher margin complementary products. But it's generally losing money on every single unit, so it's highly situational.
And just to circle back one last time, the sources consistently reinforce that sustainable pricing, just like sustainable cost management, must integrate those ethical and non-financial considerations we talked about earlier. It can't just be about maximizing short-term profit figures.
Absolutely. You can set a price that looks optimal on a spreadsheet for the next quarter, but if it's perceived by customers, employees, or the public as exploitative, unfair, or damaging to the environment or community, that financial gain simply won't be sustainable in the long run. Reputation and trust are incredibly valuable, fragile assets.
Wow, that truly was a deep dive. We've really covered a huge amount of ground here. Everything from the fundamental tools like CVP analysis and activity-based costing.
To the critical concept of identifying relevant costs and revenues for tackling specific short-term decisions, those make or buy, sell or process, keep or drop dilemmas, illustrated with those great examples.
Then shifting to navigate the complex world of pricing. Understanding how market structures like oligopoly or perfect competition influence strategy, exploring different methods for setting prices, cost-based, competition-based, value-based.
Looking at pricing new products versus existing ones, the unique challenges of pricing services, how pricing changes over the product life cycle, and even pricing in emerging markets in special situations like recessions.
And throughout it all, that vital thread of balancing the quantitative financial analysis with the equally important non-financial and ethical factors for long-term success and sustainability.
It's clear that these sources provide a really comprehensive toolkit for businesses facing these critical financial and operational decisions. They offer frameworks, formulas, and analytical techniques, but also that crucial reminder that context, strategy, long-term impacts, and stakeholder perspectives matter just as much, if not more, than the raw numbers crunched for the next report.
Indeed. These aren't just abstract academic concepts, they're really the backbone of how successful and hopefully responsible businesses make tough choices every single day. Understanding them gives you, our listener, a powerful lens to view and analyze the business world around you.
Absolutely. It helps decode why companies make the decisions they do.
So here's a final thought for you to perhaps mull over as you go about your week. In a world increasingly driven by data, algorithms, and maybe even AI suggesting optimal prices or cost structures, how can businesses ensure they aren't just blindly following the numbers spat out by a standard analysis?
How do they make sure they are actively, consciously considering the real-world ripple effects of their decisions, the impact on their employees, their customers, their communities, the planet, and ultimately their own long-term reputation and viability?
Maybe think about a business decision you've encountered recently, perhaps a new product launch you saw, a change in service from a company you use, or even a local store closing down.
Could applying some of the ideas we discussed today, thinking about the likely relevant costs involved, considering the pricing strategy in light of market conditions, or speculating about the non-financial impacts that might have been weighed or ignored, shed any new light on why that decision might have been made, or perhaps how it should have been made differently. Something to ponder.